Book of Enoch, the shocking story of watchers, Noah and Nephilim. For centuries, the Book of Enoch has drifted like a phantom across the edges of sacred history, a scripture exiled, whispered about in hushed tones, feared by priests, and branded as too dangerous for ordinary eyes. It has been called heresy, blasphemy, even madness, and yet within its fragile pages breathes a story too raw, too unsettling, to be forgotten. Why was it hidden? Why was it silenced? Perhaps because it does not sing lullabies to the soul but strikes it like thunder, not to comfort humanity, but to awaken it with a tremor of cosmic dread. This is no gentle morality tale recited in Sunday school. It is a revelation that transforms heaven into a battlefield and earth into a workshop of rebellion. In its vision, radiant beings, the Watchers descend not to guide humanity, but to betray their station. Sent as guardians, they gaze instead with desire upon the daughters of men, and in that gaze they fracture the law of heaven. Their fall was not a stumble of passion, but a cataclysm, unleashing chaos upon creation itself. From this forbidden union were born the Nephilim giants, hybrids, monstrous echoes of corrupted divinity, walking contradictions of heaven's light and earth's dust. And then emerges Noah, not merely the quiet builder of an ark, but a man burdened with hidden knowledge. He is entrusted with wisdom so heavy, it threatens to undo the very fabric of the cosmos. The flood, in this telling, is no simple punishment for sin. It is the radical erasure of an experiment gone wrong, a cleansing not just of humanity's wickedness, but of a corruption seeded by heaven's own rebels. So why, you may ask, was this tale silenced? Why does the modern Bible exclude the Book of Enoch? The answer may be more disturbing than the story itself. To read Enoch is to tear away the veil of order, to confront the possibility that the universe is not as stable, not as safe as we have been told. It is to recognize that humanity has always been entangled in a war it cannot see, a war waged not only on earth, but in the heights of heaven. And so we descend together into this forbidden narrative, the secret priests sought to bury, the mystery kings sought to erase, and the truth that survives only in fragments, stubborn against time. If this story stirs you, if you feel the weight of these revelations, I invite you to subscribe, share your thoughts, and leave a comment below. Your voice is part of this journey, and together we can keep alive the truths that were never meant to die. The Watchers angels who defied heaven and corrupted earth. Imagine a time before empires, before the pyramids rose like sentinels on the Nile, before even the idea of civilization was etched into stone. Humanity was young, fragile, fumbling through existence. We looked up at the stars and trembled, seeing them as eyes of wild, endless watchers in the night. And then, according to the Book of Enoch, they truly came, not in metaphor, not in vision, but in flesh. The Watchers, a host of heavenly beings, descended upon Mount Hermon. They were not demons nor monsters, but angels, brilliant, powerful, radiant. They were meant to protect, to teach in wisdom, to guard humanity in its infancy. But something went terribly wrong. They looked upon human women, and desire grew where only duty was meant to exist. The book tells us that their leader, Semjasa, feared he alone would bear the guilt of this transgression. So he bound his brethren with an oath, swearing together to take wives, to enter into the flesh, to corrupt themselves with lust. And so they did. The earth became their playground, and man became their experiment. From this act of rebellion came offspring unlike any the world had ever seen, the Nephilim. These beings were neither fully divine nor fully human, but a monstrous in-between. Giants of staggering size. Their appetites were insatiable. They consumed not only food but life itself, devouring the labor of men, leaving famine in their wake. Some traditions say they drank blood, that they became predators of humankind. The Watchers had not created life, they had unleashed chaos. But their corruption did not stop there. For the Watchers also brought knowledge, forbidden secrets meant only for heaven's throne. They taught mankind the arts of war, the forging of weapons, the mysteries of enchantments, and the painting of faces. They opened the doors to vanity and violence, to sorcery and bloodshed. In other words, they gave us tools too sharp for hands too innocent. Is it any wonder that the world spiraled into darkness? If Genesis offers us the simple line, "The earth was filled with violence," the Book of Enoch paints the bloody mural in all its detail. It was not merely human corruption, it was angelic intervention. Heaven had reached down to earth, but instead of lifting man up, it pulled man into ruin. And here lies the shocking revelation. The fall of humanity was not entirely our fault. We were not the sole architects of sin. We were pushed, tempted, twisted by beings who should have known better, who wore the mantle of heaven but abandoned its law. The Watchers did not just fall, they dragged mankind with them. Think of the emotional weight of this idea. For so long, religious tradition has told us that we alone are guilty, that Adam and Eve's apple damned us, but Enoch whispers another truth, that forces greater than us conspired in our downfall, that the guilt of blood, war, and corruption is not wholly human, it is also angelic. No wonder the Book of Enoch was buried. What church, what priest, would want to admit that the sins of the world were seated by heaven's own rebels? Yet the story does not end in despair. For as the cries of the earth grew unbearable, mothers mourning their children, devoured by giants, fields ruined by famine, cities drowned in blood, the Most High took notice. The Watchers had gone too far, and their experiment was about to end. Judgment was coming, swift and final. Enoch, the man who walked with God, was chosen as the scribe of this judgment. He became the messenger, delivering warnings to the fallen angels themselves. Imagine the weight of that task. A mortal man standing before radiant but corrupted beings, proclaiming that their fate was sealed, that chains awaited them, that the abyss yawned to swallow their brilliance. And yet, even as the Watchers begged for mercy, the heavens were silent. No forgiveness was offered. The decree was written. They would be bound, cast into darkness. Their offspring, the Nephilim, would perish, and the earth itself would be purged. But before the purge, before the flood, one man would be prepared. One man who would carry the hidden knowledge of this rebellion and survive the storm. That man was Noah. Noah's hidden warning, the secret knowledge the flood tried to erase. When most of us hear the name Noah, our minds summon a gentle image, a bearded man with an ark, two animals of every kind marching dutifully inside, a rainbow breaking through the storm. It is a picture book vision, safe enough for children's classrooms and nursery murals. But the Noah of the Book of Enoch is not that harmless, grandfatherly figure. He is a man who carried a terrible burden, a secret knowledge that placed him at the very crossroads of heaven's war against corruption. Why Noah? Why him, of all men? Genesis tells us simply, Noah was righteous in his generation. But Enoch reveals something deeper, something unsettling. Noah was not merely righteous, he was different. His birth itself was a matter of cosmic wonder. The ancient texts describe him as glowing with a strange radiance, his eyes shining like the sun, his skin white as snow, his hair as white as wool. When his father Lamech saw the child, he trembled. He thought perhaps his wife had lain with one of the Watchers, that this luminous infant was not human at all. And here again, we are thrust into mystery. Was Noah entirely of this world? Or was he himself a product of divine intervention, chosen, fashioned, preserved for a purpose larger than survival? If so, then the flood was not simply about cleansing the earth. It was about protecting a bloodline, a remnant of purity in a world gone mad with hybrid corruption. But Noah's role was not merely genetic, it was prophetic. For Enoch, his great-grandfather, had already walked among the heavens, already witnessed the fate of the Watchers, already recorded the cosmic trial in which they were condemned. And though Enoch was taken up into heaven, his knowledge was not lost. It was whispered into the line of Seth, passed down through Methuselah, carried into the very veins of Noah. This is the hidden warning, that the flood was not simply punishment for humanity's sins, but a surgical act to erase a contagion, to wash away the Nephilim, the half-divine aberrations that had poisoned creation itself. The waters were not just cleansing, they were erasing history, burying the evidence of angelic rebellion beneath mud and sea. And here lies the disturbing thought. If the Nephilim had consumed the world, what would humanity have become? Would our story have ended before it began? Would we have been slaves, prey, or subjects to monstrous overlords who bore heaven's radiance and hell's appetite? Noah's Ark, then, was not just a survival raft. It was the lifeboat of human destiny, the fragile vessel carrying forward the possibility of mankind itself. But consider the philosophy of this moment. The flood is not merely a myth of destruction. It is an allegory of knowledge suppressed, of truths erased. For what is a flood but a drowning of memory? Cities, graves, scrolls, monuments, all washed away. What the flood truly did was bury the uncomfortable truth that angels had walked among us, that heaven's order had been fractured, that our world had once been invaded by the divine. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the echo of this erasure in every culture. Nearly every ancient civilization has its flood story. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, even the native tribes of the Americas. Is it coincidence, or is it the residue of a memory so traumatic, so global, that it could not be forgotten, even if it was forbidden? But here is the philosophical twist. If the flood was meant to erase knowledge, then Noah himself was its contradiction. For he carried within him the very secret the water sought to drown. He was chosen not just to survive, but to remember, to preserve the wisdom of Enoch, the warnings of the Watchers, the awareness of the Nephilim. In this sense, Noah was not merely a savior of species, he was the last living library of forbidden truth. And this explains the strange aura of Noah's story. Why does Genesis gloss over him so quickly, telling us little beyond the ark, the animals, and the rainbow? Perhaps because to tell more would be to unveil too much. Perhaps because within his memory lay the unutterable, that man is not alone, that we have been manipulated, guided, and corrupted by beings outside our comprehension. To reveal that would be to strip away the comfortable illusion that God alone shaped our story without interference. Imagine Noah then, not as a quaint farmer, but as a haunted man. Every board of his ark nailed with trembling hands, not only against rain, but against despair. He knew what others did not, that his neighbors, his friends, his kin, were not merely sinners, they were infected by the legacy of the Watchers. The very blood of giants ran through their veins, and as the rain fell, as screams rose from the drowning earth, Noah carried in his heart the unbearable knowledge that he was watching not only a judgment, but an erasure of history. What is more tragic, that God destroyed the earth because men were wicked, or that God destroyed the earth because men had been made wicked by beings who betrayed heaven? Which is more terrible, that humanity deserved the flood, or that humanity was swept away as collateral in a war between heaven and its own rebels? This is the hidden warning. The flood was not merely a punishment, it was a precedent. It whispers that whenever corruption reaches too deep, whenever the balance of creation tilts too far, the universe itself will reset with terrifying force. And it warns us, the erasures of history are never as complete as they seem. Truth has a way of resurfacing, even after millennia under the waves. And perhaps that is why the Book of Enoch still survives in fragments, still whispers through the ages. For though the flood drowned the giants, though the church silenced the book, though kings and priests branded it heresy, its voice cannot be fully erased. It insists on being heard, on telling us that the story of Noah was not about animals marching two by two. It was about humanity brushing against extinction and surviving only because heaven intervened with one last ark of hope. And so, when we read of Noah, we must not read him as myth, nor as children's tale, but as the lone survivor of an apocalypse that sought to bury not only flesh, but memory. He was the keeper of a warning, a man whose bloodline carried forward a secret that has haunted our species ever since, that the world we inhabit is not simple, not safe, and never entirely ours. Rise of the Nephilim giants, hybrids, and the bloodline of chaos. They were born on the threshold too vast for the cradle, too luminous for the grave. The ancient texts call them Nephilim, beings whose first breath did not merely fog the air, but seemed to tilt the axis of the world. They were the children of the paradox, heaven's rebels and earth's innocence entwined. If the Watchers were the transgression, the Nephilim were the consequence walking verdicts against a boundary that should never have been crossed. To understand their terror, we must begin with categories. Reality is held together not only by forces, but by distinctions: light from darkness, sea from land, human from divine. The Nephilim are what happens when categories are profaned, when the latticework of creation is bent until it screams. They were not simply giants in the sense of height, though many traditions speak of their stature, their weight upon the earth, their shadows spanning fields at noon. They were excess itself made flesh, excess appetite, excess strength, excess will. Wherever they walked, scale became a weapon. The stories say their hunger was a storm. They ate the harvest of villages in a single sitting, the cattle with the grass still caught in their teeth. When the stores ran empty, they turned to violence, and when violence no longer sated them, they turned to flesh. This is the detail that haunts, the pivot from dominion to devouring, from ruling to consuming the very people they were born among. The Nephilim made the world into a pantry, then into a grave. By their existence, they inverted every moral intuition. Power was no longer a trust but a license, and might made right because there was nothing left that could say no. But their terror was not only physical. The Watchers, in their hubris, had given forbidden instruction, brilliant, glittering fragments of heavenly knowledge smashed upon the floor of earth like stained glass. From these shards, the Nephilim learned not wisdom, but leverage. Metal is not evil. A sword is only a question with a sharp edge. Yet in the hands of those who do not bleed easily, every question ends the same way. The fallen taught enchantments, pharmakeia, the seductions of glamour, the sway of secret names. They taught the drawing of constellations as if the sky were a map one could conquer. The Nephilim drank these powers like wine and then demanded the vineyard. Civilizations keep memories even when they forget facts. And you can hear, across continents and centuries, the echo of a trauma, towering figures who bend human fate, hybrid heroes whose greatness always tastes faintly of horror, tales of a primordial age when the gods mingled with mortals and left monsters behind. Perhaps this is cultural coincidence, or perhaps it is the human psyche, trying not to remember and remembering anyway, whispering that once, long ago, power entered the world unaccompanied by humility, and the earth answered by groaning. Philosophically, the Nephilim expose a problem that recurs in every age: the acceleration of capacity without the maturation of conscience. If we strip away the mythic garments, we recognize their silhouette in our modern anxieties. What is a giant if not any force that outruns the moral muscle needed to control it? A technology without a soul behind it is a Nephilim in embryo. An empire that feeds on the weak is a giant wearing a crown. Even an idea that devours all competing truths until only itself remains, that too is a kind of giant, a devourer of meanings. The Nephilim are not simply characters in an ancient drama. They are the perennial caution that power, once unmoored from reverence, becomes ravenous. This is why the soil itself is a character in Enoch's telling. The ground cries out. The rivers choke on blood. Creation, which was called good, now recoils from what walks upon it. There is a philosophy here deep enough to drown in. Nature has a memory of justice. It will not endure an imbalance forever. The Nephilim stretch reality like a drum. The flood that follows is not only punishment, but physics, the snapback of a moral universe bent beyond its tolerance. Yet even in their terror, the Nephilim fascinate. Human beings are drawn to the boundary breacher the way sailors are drawn to sirens. These hybrids promised a shortcut to greatness. Learn from us, follow us, serve us, and you will partake in our magnitude. The bargain is always the same in every age. Give up slow virtue for fast power. The price also the same: your humanity. This is why their stories end in ruins. The Nephilim are monuments to the seduction of transcendence without transformation, a leap to the heavens without the ladder of the soul. There is another riddle embedded in their legacy. Why do the texts, canonical and otherwise, hint that after the deluge, giants were on the earth in those days and also afterward? It is as if the flood erased the chalkboard, but a ghost of the writing remained. The philosophical implication is chilling. Corruption, once introduced, is not easily cured. Even when washed away, it leaves a pattern, a possibility, a memory in the world. The forces that birthed the Nephilim arrogance, appetite, the lust for secret knowledge, are not geological layers. They are spiritual climates, and climates return. So the bloodline of chaos is not merely genetic. It is cultural, moral, metaphysical. You detect it when a society begins to admire those who can break rules rather than those who can keep faith. You feel it when spectacle replaces meaning, when fame becomes the counterfeit of glory, when leaders feed on those they lead. Wherever these signs multiply, the Nephilim are not far, if not in bone, then in spirit. Giants do not need colossal bones to stride across a people. They only require a collective forgetfulness of what makes power beautiful. Restraint, service, awe before the sacred. Here the Book of Enoch insists on a scandalous mercy disguised as judgment. The extinction of the Nephilim is told like a tragedy for them and a salvation for us. Imagine a surgeon trembling, forced to cut deep because infection has reached the marrow. No one rejoices at the saw, yet without it, the patient dies. The flood is that trembling cut. It is the world choosing amputation over septic glory. We are meant to feel both relief and grief, the relief of survival, the grief of what needed to be done to achieve it. But the Nephilim's shadow lingers not only as a warning, but as an inverted halo around the figure of the human being. Against their towering silhouettes, the dignity of an ordinary person is thrown into dramatic relief. The true miracle in Enoch's world is not the angel or the giant. It is the mortal who chooses fidelity over force, the small life anchored to a large God. Noah's quiet obedience humiliates the giants more thoroughly than any spear could, because it reveals what the universe actually honors. The storm washes away the architecture of excess and leaves standing a single household that believes in boundaries. There is also a private, psychological reading of the Nephilim story, a journey into the interior where we meet our own hybrids. Who among us does not carry warring impulses, noble aspirations tangled with appetites that ask to be fed at any cost? The Nephilim externalize a problem of the heart. When the higher and lower within us form an alliance without wisdom, the result is a giant that rules the inner kingdom with cruelty. The flood then becomes a metaphor for repentance, the painful unmaking of an ego that has grown too large to love. If this interpretation feels modern, it is only because the ancients were wiser than we assume. They knew that monsters first roam the mind before they stride across the earth. And so the question returns, searching as a blade. What do we worship? In Enoch's world, worship is not merely a song, but an alignment of love. The Watchers misplaced their love and thus misused their knowledge. The Nephilim magnified this misalignment until it shattered the world. Every culture, every generation, every person must answer the same call: to love power or to love the good and use power in its service. The first path manufactures giants. The second cultivates saints. When the waters finally receded, they left a landscape scrubbed raw, a world that smelled of wood pitch and new beginnings. The silence after catastrophe is its own liturgy. From that silence emerges a single quiet conviction: never again. Never again will we admire what devours us. Never again will we mistake restraint for sanctity, by for president spectacle for truth. Of course, humanity will forget. We always do. But the myth remembers for us. And every time we tell it, the earth seems to nod as if to say, yes, that happened once, and it happens still. The Nephilim, then, are not simply a chapter in a forbidden book. They are the mirror we dread and the prophecy we need. Their rise tells us how worlds break. Their fall tells us how worlds heal. Between those two, a man builds an ark, and a god draws a boundary in water and light. The rainbow that follows is not sentimental decoration. It is a cosmic signature under a hard-won truth. Creation endures only when power bows to goodness. From here, the most unsettling question remains. If this story bears even a fragment of truth, why was it concealed? Why were these pages banished to the margins, their warnings smothered under centuries of suspicion? To ask is to tug on a thread woven through theology, politics, and fear. Pull hard enough, and the fabric of official history begins to pucker. That too is part of the shock of Enoch, not only what it says about the past, but what its suppression says about us. Forbidden truths why the Book of Enoch was banished from the Bible. The suppression of the Book of Enoch is itself a revelation. Books do not vanish by accident. Stories do not simply fall out of memory. When an ancient text disappears, especially one once revered by communities of faith, it is often because its words struck too deeply, raised questions too dangerous, or painted truths too unsettling for the guardians of orthodoxy to allow. And so we must ask, why was Enoch silenced? In the earliest centuries, this book was no fringe curiosity. The Jewish sect at Qumran, the keepers of the Dead Sea Scrolls, copied it with devotion. Early Christians knew it, quoted it, wove it into their theology. The New Testament itself alludes to Enoch. The Epistle of Jude directly cites his prophecy of judgment. Imagine that, a banned book quoted in the canon itself. For a moment in history, the Book of Enoch was not heresy but scripture. Then, like a star behind clouds, it vanished. It is so. Why? Because it told a story that threatened the fragile architecture of religious power. First, the Book of Enoch paints a world where angels themselves are fallible, corruptible, participants in the tragedy of sin. It dares to suggest that heaven's household is not immune to rebellion. To admit this is to admit that the neat boundary between divine perfection and human corruption is porous. Priests, theologians, rulers, they feared the implication. For if even the heavens stumble, what claim can earthly institutions make to infallibility? What hierarchy can be trusted without question? The Book of Enoch shifts blame from mankind alone and exposes a cosmic drama where we are not merely guilty, but manipulated. This truth is too liberating, too destabilizing. It wrests history away from the pulpits of blame and places it in the arena of cosmic warfare. Second, the book insists that forbidden knowledge was given to humanity by the Watchers. This is not the gentle wisdom of Proverbs or Psalms, but dangerous technology's weaponry, sorcery, vanity, domination. Enoch suggests that human civilization itself was accelerated by rebels. If that is true, then our progress is not purely divine providence, nor purely human genius. It is contaminated inheritance. What ruler, what empire wants its legitimacy questioned by a book that whispers, "Your very tools of power may descend from a forbidden source"? Better to silence the book than to allow such suspicion to spread. Third, the Nephilim. Their existence unsettles theology at its root. If beings can exist who are neither fully divine nor fully human, what becomes of doctrines of salvation, incarnation, covenant? The very categories of faith unravel. To canonize Enoch is to canonize ambiguity, to acknowledge that our story is messier, stranger, more terrifying than creeds admit. Institutions built on clarity, on crisp lines between heaven and earth, balked at this chaos. They locked it away. And yet, perhaps the most dangerous truth of all is philosophical, rather than theological. The Book of Enoch suggests that history is cyclical, that when corruption grows too great, when power divorces itself from goodness, the cosmos intervenes in judgment. It happened once, with the flood. Could it happen again? To carry that question is to live uneasily, to measure empires not by glory, but by their distance from catastrophe. Kings prefer their subjects docile, not trembling with suspicion that another flood, literal or metaphorical, waits beyond the horizon. So the book was branded apocryphal, heretical, unnecessary. Councils convened, canons closed, shelves were cleared. What survived did so in whispers, in the care of Ethiopian Christians, in fragments buried in caves. The very act of erasure testifies to its potency. No one burns a harmless book. But suppression, paradoxically, is also confession. To silence a text is to admit it speaks. To forbid it is to confess it has power. The guardians of faith may have buried Enoch, but in doing so they revealed their fear that these pages unveiled too much, that they unveiled the machinery behind the curtain, that they unveiled the possibility that humanity has never been alone in its shaping. The philosophical question for us today is not simply, was the Book of Enoch true? It is also, what does it mean that truth can be hidden at all? If sacred history can be redacted, then every believer, every seeker, carries the duty of suspicion, of looking beyond official lines for the silenced voices. The act of reading Enoch becomes a moral rebellion, a way of standing with those ancient watchers and recognizing that knowledge, though dangerous, cannot be unlearned once given. But there is also tragedy here, for if the book had remained, perhaps our religious imagination would be broader, more resilient. Perhaps we would not divide the world so neatly into saints and sinners, angels and demons, but recognize the messy middle where power corrupts all beings, heavenly or human. Perhaps we would be less quick to idolize leaders, less naive about our empires, more cautious with our technologies. The loss of Enoch is not only the loss of a story, it is the loss of a warning. And yet the book refuses to die. Fragments surface, translations spread, seekers rediscover it in dusty monasteries and digital archives. It lives because it speaks to something primal in us. The suspicion that the world is stranger than we are told, that our ancestors knew terrors we have forgotten, that the neat fences of orthodoxy cannot contain the wild landscape of human memory. So here we stand, reading a forbidden text, not merely as scholars, but as inheritors of a silenced truth. The Watchers, the Nephilim, Noah's hidden knowledge all rise again from the grave of suppression. And their voice is not gentle. It asks us, what powers walk among us today? What forbidden knowledge do we wield? What giants, visible or invisible, have we allowed to grow? And what flood, literal or metaphorical, waits for our generation if we refuse to remember? The Book of Enoch does not flatter. It does not soothe. It unsettles, destabilizes, confronts. And perhaps that is why it belongs not hidden in the margins, but spoken in the open. For the truths that disturb us most are the truths we most need to hear.